The year's 1945. The most destructive war in human history is over. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Japan has surrendered. Soldiers across the Pacific are laying down their weapons, walking out of jungles, boarding ships home. Families are reuniting. The world is exhaling for the first time in 6 years. In a dense jungle on the Philippine island of Lubang, a 23-year-old Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda tightens his grip on his rifle and keeps fighting. He will not stop for another 29 years. To understand how this is even possible, you need to understand who Hiroo Onoda was. He was not someone who ended up in the jungle by accident or confusion. He was trained at the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, Japan's elite military intelligence academy. The school that produced Japan's most disciplined, most psychologically resilient, most mission-committed operatives. His final orders before deployment were given to him directly by his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The orders were simple and absolute. You will never surrender, you will never take your own life, and you will wait for further orders. Those words were still running in Hiroo Onoda's mind when the war ended, and they would keep running for 3 decades. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, leaflets were dropped across the Philippine jungle, thousands of them, fluttering down through the canopy, landing at the feet of soldiers who had no radio contact. The leaflets said the war was over, Japan had surrendered. Onoda read them and immediately identified them as enemy propaganda, because that is exactly what his training told him to expect. Stay at your post. Carry out your mission. He had been trained so completely that the truth was indistinguishable from a trap. So he stayed. His unit at this point consisted of 3 other soldiers. They raided local villages for food and supplies. They watched, they waited, they fought. One by one, the others left. One surrendered in 1950 after his family's letters were dropped from a plane specifically to reach him. One was shot and killed during a skirmish in 1954. And then there was one, alone, in the jungle, still completely certain that what everyone was telling him was enemy manipulation. Think about what this actually means for a moment. The first human being walked on the moon while he was in that jungle. An entire generation was born, grew up, and had children of their own while he was in that jungle. Japan rebuilt itself from the rubble of total defeat into one of the most prosperous economies on earth. He was not suffering from delusion. He was not mentally ill. He was completely rational, completely coherent. His father traveled to the Philippines personally. Onoda watched all of it from the trees and identified all of it as sophisticated enemy psychological operations designed to break his will. The most heartbreaking searches were the ones conducted by Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was a young Japanese adventurer who in 1974 decided, apparently on a personal challenge, to go into the Philippine jungle and find Hiroo Onoda. He told friends he was going to look for Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He found Onoda within 4 days. They spoke. They built a small fire. Onoda was warm, lucid, and completely reasonable. He explained his position clearly. He was a soldier on active duty. He had received no orders to stand down. He could not surrender without orders from a superior officer. This was not stubbornness. This was simply the reality of his situation as he understood it. Suzuki went back to Japan and came back with Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi stood in a clearing in the jungle and formally read new orders to Hiroo Onoda. The war was over. His mission was complete. He was to lay down his arms immediately. Onoda listened to every word. Then he took off his pack. He unloaded his rifle. He placed his ammunition on the ground in a neat pile. He had approximately 500 rounds remaining. His rifle was perfectly maintained and fully functional after 29 years in a tropical jungle. His sword was sharp. His uniform was worn, but intact. He had been ready to fight until the moment he was told not to. When he walked out of the jungle, The Philippine government initially planned to prosecute him for acts committed during his 3 decades of guerrilla activity, including the deaths of approximately 30 Filipino civilians and police officers. The president of the Philippines issued a personal pardon. Onoda was a soldier following orders. He had never stopped being one. He returned to Japan, to a reception he was completely unprepared for. The country that had sent him into that jungle no longer existed. He gave interviews. He said he had no regrets because regret implied he had done something wrong. He moved to Brazil shortly after returning. He said Japan had become too soft. He could not adapt to a country that had forgotten the values he had spent 30 years living inside. He eventually returned to Japan in his later years. He started a nature school for young people. He lived quietly. He wrote a memoir. He gave occasional lectures. He died in 2014 at the age of 91. And here's the question that his story leaves sitting in the room long after you have finished reading it. At what point does loyalty become a prison? Onoda was not a fanatic in the way we usually picture one. He was not driven by hatred or ideology or violence for its own sake. He was driven by something much simpler and much more human than that. He had been given a task. He had made a commitment. And he was not the kind of man who walked away from either. The war gave him a purpose so total and so complete that when the war ended, the purpose simply continued. We tell stories like his expecting to feel pity or horror or secondhand embarrassment at the tragedy of a wasted life. But there is something else underneath all of that, something that is harder to dismiss. Hiroo Onoda knew exactly who he was. He was wrong about almost everything, but he was never lost. Most people spend their entire lives searching for that feeling. He had it in a jungle in the Philippines for 3 decades. He just didn't know the war was over.